Hello. This is a discussion of pesticide labels and labeling. It corresponds to Unit 3 of the Virginia Core Manual Applying Pesticides Correctly. The Core Manual does a very nice job of covering pesticide labeling, so this lecture is intended to reinforce the high points. Pesticide labeling has to meet EPA standards. In fact, before any pesticide product can be sold in the United States, the label must be reviewed by the EPA, and EPA is looking to ensure that all the information for safe, proper, and effective use can be found on the label. There are required parts. There are certain things that have to be on every label. Those being identifying information, what's in it, whether it's classified as restricted or general use, and we'll talk about that at some length later. Precautionary statements that range from first aid to protective clothing to environmental hazards and physical and chemical hazards that might be encountered by users, directions for use, and storage and disposal information. It's also important to note that there are several types of pesticide registration, and this is reflected on the label. First of all, there's a federal label, or a Section 3, which is basically I don't want to say a blanket, but it's a registration that's uniform across the U.S. Now, having said that, at least one state, California, has its own registration process. So anything that's sold in that state has to be registered both with the EPA and the California Department of Ag. But Virginia doesn't have anything like that, and anything that's got a federal label can be then registered for use in Virginia without any additional review. Our Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services registers those products that may be used in the state. However, you have to pay for every state registration you make, and a lot of manufacturers of products labeled for cranberries, for example, or tobacco, it doesn't make sense to register them in all 50 states. There's no tobacco grown in Alaska, there's no cranberries grown in Florida, and so oftentimes you'll see state local need, or SLN, labels. There's a special section of FIFRA that allows for this, and these would be supplemental labels of sorts for products that are labeled on certain crops only in those state or areas where the crops are grown. This is common in Virginia. There's a few state local need labels for tobacco, some of the brambles perhaps. Another good example would be peanuts. Even though it's a big crop here in Virginia, as is tobacco, it's not grown nationwide. And then finally, there are emergency exemptions granted, and they too have supplemental labeling. These emergency exemptions, though, are at least intended for acute emergencies, pest outbreaks that are sudden and unexpected, and for which there aren't really good labeled products. A supplemental label can be granted for something that's already got a food crop label, but perhaps not on that food crop, and then it may be used to take care of the emergency. This is a Section 18. They're not supposed to be for life. The products that get Section 18s are supposed to get a full label at some point, or a SLN label at some point. But that does allow growers who are facing an emergency with no pest control tools in the chemical line to use an out. Now, classification of pesticides, that's an important point on the label, whether they're general use, which means anybody can buy them, or restricted use, which means you get carded before you can buy these. You have to flash the certificate issued by your state that allows you to purchase a restricted use product. More about that later. The parts of a label. As I said, one of the main parts, and the part you'll encounter first when you look at the product, is identifying information. And that consists of many pieces and parts. One is the brand name. In this example, I've picked Caseron 4G. Then they'll also, right underneath, give you an ingredient statement that tells you the technical chemical name of the product, in this case 2,6-dichlorobenzonitrile, and also a common name that people go by, diclofenac. It's really possible that you'll find diclofenac-containing products with other brand names than Caseron. So in some senses, it's worth knowing the common chemical name for the ingredient. Identifying information also tells you how much of the active ingredient is in there. The active ingredient is usually given in a percent by weight, and then the inerts, which don't have to be identified as to their specific composition, are also indicated by percent. Another real important part of the identifying information is the EPA registration number. I've bolded that because it's very important, and the establishment number. The registration number is like the fingerprint for the product. Every different product has a specific different registration number. The first part of the number on the left of the hyphen identifies the company, and the rest of the number, the 168 in this case, identifies the specific product. In this case, we're talking about Caseron 4G. You can use that number to tell exactly what product you have. If there are diclobanyl liquids, they will have a different number. If there's a diclobanyl 2G, it will have a different number. But if diclobanyl 4G comes in 20-pound bags and 50-pound bags, they'll have the same number. It's real important. Most of the record-keeping forms that you would have to fill out, or many of the record-keeping forms that you may use as optional, will ask for the EPA registration number. And that's because it's better than saying diclobanyl and then you don't know what formulation or what brand. It's better than saying Caseron, because 5 years from now, somebody might put a different active ingredient in a product and call it Caseron. There are some names, like Weed B Gone is a good example. You can find a zillion products that use that common popular trade name and have all different ingredients, percents, and on and on. So the registration number is worth noting, and the EPA establishment number identifies the place where the product was manufactured. That might be important in case of a recall. It also might be important if you have a problem with performance or a product and you want to report it. And then one of the first things they're going to ask for that establishment number to see where the stuff was made and see if they've had similar problems with the batch. The next part of identifying information is simply going to be the name of the product, which usually identifies what kind of pesticide it is and what kind of use pattern is allowed. Usually the name is descriptive. Usually they don't just say diclobanyl. The name will say diclobanyl weed and grass killer, and that tells you that you're talking about an herbicide, and often as not will identify the places or sites where it's legal to use it. More on identifying information. Often as not, the name gives you some clue as to the formulation. Now, formulations are covered in Unit 4 of your core manual, and we've not got into that in any great depth at this stage of the game. But you probably know that there are liquids and dries and several types of liquids, examples, solutions or emulsifiable concentrates, lots of types of dries like granules, dusts, and on and on. Well, often as not, the name of the product will, in this case, confirm 2F. That's probably a 2-pound gallon or a 2% flowable, but they're trying to give you a clue there about not just what's in the product, but what concentration. Caseron 4G is a 4% granule. The last part of identifying information is the name, address, and other identifying information about the product's manufacturer. Finally, the classification of the pesticide, specifically whether or not it's restricted use, will be noted there. If it is restricted use, often as not, the label explains why. Here's an example of a restricted use pesticide, and the words restricted use pesticide appear prominently right under the brand name and a little bit more of identifying the use pattern for the product. It also, if you regard this label, this MOCAP 20% G label, it tells you why it's restricted use, because of acute dermal toxicity, and the skull and crossbones and the danger poison signal word are other clues that this is a product to be treated with the greatest of respect. There are, however, other reasons for classifying a product as restricted use than toxicity. Now, it is true that all the acutely toxic products, or those that affect humans acutely, are classified as restricted use. And in the old days, those were the only products that were restricted by EPA. But now EPA has kind of broadened the scope of the restricted use classification to include things with hazards to the environment or to other organisms aside from man. Here's a great example. Atrex 4L is restricted use because of groundwater concerns and surface water concerns as well. This product is not particularly toxic, but it's moderately persistent. It's very heavily used in the Corn Belt, and in some situations it's appearing in groundwater, which is a concern to many people, to the EPA, and for that reason EPA moved it to restricted use. This ensures that only people who have training can purchase the product. In other words, it's only available to certified applicators. Note that it carries a caution signal word. We've not talked about that yet, but that's the most benign of the signal word options. It's not really toxicity that made this restricted use. It's the fact that it hangs around long enough and is soluble enough to move from where it's applied into water sources. Here's another case of a restricted use product that's restricted because this chemical is more toxic to birds than it is to mammals. And because it poses a risk to birds and also to aquatic invertebrates, it's been moved to the restricted use list as well. Again, even though it just carries a caution label. The next major segment of things you'll find on a label are precautionary statements. And it's important to note that all pesticides carry a child hazard warning statement. It says in caps, keep out of the reach of children. Every pesticide will have that. Right underneath that, you'll see the signal word for the product. And you basically have three options: danger, poison, or danger, warning, or caution. Danger poison is the most alerting signal word I guess you could have. Danger poison with the skull and crossbones symbol means that this product is extremely toxic to people and usually extremely toxic to all organisms. A danger label is assigned to products that are fairly toxic, certainly worth your respect and time and particular care. They may be acutely toxic by some route of entry. They may not be a single-digit toxicity, but still well below the 0 to 50 that allows for this classification. The point is that if you see a danger label, you need to sit up and pay attention. The intermediate ground, generally reserved for products that are of moderate toxicity, is the warning label. Warning is supposed to tell you that this product, too, may be difficult to manage and must be handled with care. Caution label products are still worth your respect and care and consideration, but that means that they're basically lower in toxicity than the other options. The general cut is 0 to 50 for danger, 50 to 500 for warning, and 500 or greater for caution. Now, pesticides can be assigned a more stringent signal word, but they won't be downgraded. All pesticides must carry some signal word. So even if and when baking soda is registered as a fungicide, and that's a very real possibility, and it may be very effective for certain foliar diseases, it will still carry a caution label. Continuing with precautionary statements, you will find in that section statement of practical treatment, and in plain English we're talking first aid instructions. They will tell you specifically what to do in case of an exposure. They are invaluable references at this point, and most importantly in case a pesticide is accidentally ingested, because they'll tell you whether you should or in some cases should not induce vomiting. But basically this is one good reason why the label should travel with any person who's exposed to the doctor. Precautionary statements will also include emergency contacts, and they will or may list protective clothing requirements. The protective clothing requirements are also listed again, usually in the ag and non-ag use directions, and we'll get to that in a bit. But usually PPE shows up right there too, so if you have to wear gloves or an apron when mixing or a face shield, it'll be explained to you in the precautionary statements. Precautionary statements include information about specific hazards to people, to domestic animals, to the environment, any physical or chemical property that makes this pesticide difficult to handle or store, and then there will be user safety recommendations. These are generally good management practices as far as how the pesticide should be mixed, measured, and handled. The label will include conditions of sale and limitations of warranty and liability information. And what this boils down to is the registrant's telling you, if you don't follow the directions, don't blame us. And it really does limit their liability for poor performance if not handled as directed. The next and very long section of the label, as a rule, are the directions for use, and this section always begins with the standard misuse statement. It is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling, and it means exactly what it says. The label's the law. It's your obligation to follow it to the letter. Then there may be other statements, things you should do, things you should not do. Right at the beginning of the directions for use, you will find one or two boxes, ag use requirements, non-ag use requirements. Some labels have only ag use requirements if they're only registered for agricultural commodities. Others may have only non-ag use requirements if they're labeled, for example, only for right-of-way. And some, for example, a forestry product may have both because it's used in a commodity, that being forest crops, and it usually has a right-of-way label as well. So, depending on your use pattern, you follow whichever box applies. If you're a cotton farmer, you'd use the ag use requirements. If you're a landscaper, you follow the non-ag use requirements. But these sections will tell you any reentry intervals you have to follow. They will tell you any protective clothing applicators and early entry workers have to wear. And they will also explain, in the case of the ag use requirements, what posting requirements and worker notification requirements are required of you. The directions for use also may include references to other documents. And this is a tough thing for the applicator because you're bound to find those other documents and comply with whatever they direct as well. A good example of this is worker protection standards. The ag use requirement box on the label will list some parts of worker protection standard requirements. For example, it will tell you what the reentry interval is. It will tell you what protective clothing applicators and early entry workers have to wear. And it will tell you if and how you must notify workers of a treated area. However, it doesn't have every single bit and piece of the worker protection standard listed on the label, much less in that box. There's many other things that you have to do under the worker protection standard if you hire ag workers. You have to have a decontamination site. You have to have a central notification so they can go look up what fields were treated and when and how long the reentry intervals are. You have to have an emergency plan for accidents and incidents, on and on. That's not all on the label. The label simply refers you to the worker protection standard with which you have to comply. EPA plans similar measures for groundwater protection. In other words, labels may say atrazine has groundwater restrictions. Find your state bulletin to follow proper use in your state. The Endangered Species Protection Program is proposed to work that way. And if and when that comes online, it will require, again, there'll be a general statement on the label saying that this product has endangered species restrictions, and then you may have to find a county or a state level bulletin that tells you where the areas are in which this product can't be used. So label by reference is kind of a tough deal, and it's worth you paying attention to any references on the label to other documents because they're really going to be part of the deal for you. Directions for use include application directions, and this basically tells you where you can put the product and how much and how often and what to use, and it will list any pest control claims, in other words, the pests that the manufacturer claims this product will control. It'll tell you whether or not to use an adjuvant. It'll tell you tank mix directions, often as not, and it'll note whether or not, and if so, how this product can be put into an irrigation system or applied by air. Finally, at the end of the directions for use, you will find any other conditions, use precautions, and perhaps storage and disposal directions. The label is the law, and what this basically means is the product label is a binding legal agreement between three parties: the U.S. EPA, who reviewed the label, the product registrant, who wrote the directions you see on the label, and the user, who's bound to follow the directions the label has to the letter. The label has all the instructions you need to use a product properly, legally, effectively. Applicators are bound to read and follow the directions to the letter. A couple important points. You can't use a pesticide any place other than those sites described on the label. And that's it. If the label is for lawns and it only describes different types of grasses and lawn areas, you can't put it on corn or cotton. You can't put it in a landscape bed. The label very specifically will outline those legal use sites or places. A good example of how this may vary, though, is this. You will find some products that are labeled for woody ornamentals. And if they leave it at that, that's a broad license. That means you can put it on a dogwood, a redbud, an ash, any shrub, small tree, or tree in an ornamental setting. Other times, though, pesticide labels will have specific rates and instructions and directions, like maybe a section for ash, a section for birch, a section for dogwood. If you look on down and there's no section for redbud, you can't use it on a redbud. So read the label and read it carefully to make sure that the use site that you want is there, because if it's not, it's illegal to use the product. Another thing I think that's pretty obvious but also pretty important is that you can't apply a pesticide over the rate listed on the label or more times than the label allows. The label will tell you how much you can put and how many times, and you have to follow that or go under it, but you can't exceed it. In summary, an applicator must follow all directions for moving the product, mixing and loading the product, applying it, putting it away, and if you have any excess you can't use, getting rid of it. And the same thing with the container. The whole schmear should be on the label. Federal law does allow pesticides to be used in some ways not specifically mentioned or prohibited by the labeling. Virginia has no such prohibitions. So in Virginia, you can apply a pesticide at a rate that is under what the label specifies. Not over now, but under. And you can also apply it less often than the label specifies. To discuss this a bit, that may be a really good idea. I mean, it's obviously going to save time and money to use less pesticide or use a pesticide less often. But if you don't have good research-based information supporting that, you might be sticking your neck out to do it. For example, if you have a weed problem in a lawn and you decide to cheap out and mix half rate and apply it, and then you go back and the weeds are just fine, thank you very much, you may have lots of problems. You may have a dissatisfied customer, you're a week or so behind the 8 ball, the weeds have had another week or so to grow, and you're back doing the same old thing. You haven't saved yourself any time, any money, and in fact you've cost yourself. So before I would reduce the rate or reduce the number of applications, I would have a good assurance that this is a recommended and safe practice, an effective practice. Again, the pest doesn't have to be on the label. Manufacturers obviously put pests on there to guide applicators and to encourage sales. And if they think that something will work on a pest, they're probably going to list it. But there are true cases of a pest being on a label and the pest is resistant enough that the pesticide really isn't going to do that much. And conversely, there are some pests that aren't listed that the pesticide may control. This is another situation where I wouldn't stick my neck out and do something like this if I didn't have good, sound, research-based information to back me up. If you have that, you may use a pesticide to control a pest that's not on the label as long as everything else is done right. For example, you can't put a pre-emergent herbicide down to foliage in August. That's not legal. If something says it has to be used pre-bloom, you can't apply it to a fully mature apple. But if you're using the right equipment at the right time, at the right rate, and following all the other application directions, you can apply a pesticide for a pest that's not specifically listed. Another fact to talk about is that you can use any appropriate application equipment. Usually, field crop type products will list mixing directions for large tanks and boom sprayers, and then they may have spot spray or small volume directions for backpack. But there's nothing to prohibit you from putting an herbicide on in a landscape bed with a paintbrush if that's the most appropriate and selective way to do it. So you can use any application equipment unless it's specifically prohibited. That works. Pesticide applicators in Virginia can mix pesticide with fertilizer. They can also mix 2 or more pesticides. Tank mixes like this are usually more and more well described and supported on the label. Manufacturers know what the common other products are that fit the pesticide use pattern of the one that they've written the label for. So a lot of times they'll have common tank mix directions for the products that one would most likely want to mix together. If they don't, though, you're well advised to do a jar test to make sure that the pesticides will all stay in solution, be compatible, not settle out, not change chemical or physical properties to the point that you can't spray them. And then after you do a jar test, you're still well advised to apply the product to a small test area to make sure you're not going to burn up your foliage and that it will indeed do the job you want it to do. However, mixing pesticides with fertilizers or mixing pesticides with pesticides is an okay thing. Labels don't prohibit that. To summarize, the label's the law. I've said that several times, and it's probably the most important point of this whole presentation. Label directions aren't advice. They're absolute legal requirements, and you must follow them. When should you read the label? Well, the right answer is all the time, but I want to talk about before purchase versus before, during, and after each use. Now, why should you read the label before you buy something? Well, the obvious answer is to make sure you can put it where you need to put it, where you want to put it. You also can learn whether the manufacturer claims it'll control the pest that you're having a problem with. You can make sure that you have all the equipment to handle it and apply it correctly. If you read the label, you'll get a good sense of whether this is what you want and whether or not you can manage it. Then, before, during, and after each use, we'll make sure that you mix it right, use it right, and put it away right. One thing to think about, why you read the label before, during, and after each use. The first point on this slide is familiarity breeds contempt, and that's an old saying that basically means you get so used to something that you don't respect it anymore. And that's not a position you want to be in with pesticides. But it's true that if you do something all the time, you get to where you think you can do it without thinking, and that's the operative word, that's the operative problem, without thinking. When you get into automatic pilot mode, when you get into, you're doing this like a robot and you're not paying attention, that's when you have your accidents. I think that's when car accidents happen. I think that's when a lot of accidents happen. And, if I'm halfway through mixing up a cake and I realize, shoot, I don't have any eggs, that's inconvenient and it's annoying, but it's not dangerous. But if you get halfway through mixing up a pesticide and you're like, oh, I'm supposed to have a face shield on and this stuff glugs out and splashes you in the face, it is a problem. It's a serious problem. So I advise you to make sure that you review the label, reread the label before every step so you have the right stuff and you follow the right directions and you don't fail to respect the products you're handling. Another good reason to read the label directions all the time is that they change. There's a bunch of regulatory issues right now that are limiting the use of some common products. Many use sites are being dropped from labels. So just because you applied product X to your lawn or to your corn or to your cattle last year doesn't mean that the product you just bought last week still has that site on the label. The rate may be different. Many things may be different. There may be a buffer zone and it wasn't there on the label last year and it's there this year. So it's incumbent on you to follow the directions you have and follow them to the letter. And if you don't realize that the label you bought this year is different from the one you used last year, you may be in violation of the law. You cannot assume, just because you've used something the same way for the last 10 years, that you're going to be able to use the same product the same way for the next 10 or even the next one. One last point about labels and a comparison of the label versus the material safety data sheet. These two documents are very different in their intended purpose. The label supports the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, EPA requirements, HAZCOM is the reason we have material safety data sheets, and they're reviewed by OSHA. Their intended uses are very different. The label's intended for the applicator. The material safety data sheet is intended to fulfill OSHA requirements and was originally generated to protect the people who handle concentrated pesticides in manufacturing and industry. So they're, in the case of a pesticide, for the person in the formulating plant who's stirring the vat or who's monitoring the materials being divvied up into packages. And they're exposed to more product, more time, and more concentrated. It's a different kind of a thing. So if, for example, you see a material safety data sheet that requires more protective clothing than the label does, you follow the label as an applicator. The good MSDSs now do have a PPE section for industrial use or industrial settings and for applicators. But if they differ, you go by the label. The material safety data sheet is information, but it's not a binding legal agreement. It's not a federal document the way the label is. If you violate the label, you've broken federal law. They also differ in the information provided. The label is more, what is this and how do you use it correctly and properly and safely, versus the material safety data sheets just giving you the hazards for the product. It's nice to have both. Follow the label, but the material safety data sheet can tell you, which the label won't, how toxic the product is, how flammable, any other particular physical or chemical information that you might want to know. You will probably find on the MSDS more so than on the label. So I advise you to keep both documents, copies in your truck, copies in your storage shed, and the label should be attached to the product it belongs to. And I thank you very much for your time, and this concludes the lecture on pesticide labeling.